Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razam Pereira. Well, the issue of delicensing E and V band telecom spectrum has divided industry bodies BIF and COAI. The bands are considered optimum for providing mobile broadband backhaul, while its utility for 5G services is also evolving, and that's why these industry bodies are at loggerheads. On September 28th, COAI had written to Communications Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad reiterating its opposition to delicensing of spectrum in the bands. Reacting to this letter, the BIF wrote to the Telecom Secretary opposing auctioning of spectrum in these bands as it goes against international best practices and TRAI guidelines, is what the BIF said. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze spectrum auction, 5G and broadband. Joining me on the program today are Lieutenant General SP Kochhar, retired Director General COAI, Mahesh Uppal, Independent Consultant, Broadband India Forum, and Sadhna Dixit, former member, Telecom Commission. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. General, I'd like to begin the program with you first. Let's first try and understand and analyze, what is the status of the latest spectrum auction?
Well, status of the spectrum auction is not known to us so far. So that is putting it very briefly. Unless we are informed by the government and there is a notification issued, we really don't know.
So why is there so much of, back and forth really between the BIF and the COI as far as these E and V band spectrum is concerned?
The E and V band are essential for 5G, and now that we are entering 5G, we feel that E and V band should be auctioned. There are reasons for that. Initially, when the TRAI guidelines came out, that time 5G was not in existence. 4G had just about entered the market, and the guidelines came at that particular time. Since then, a lot of water has flown under the bridge. What has happened now is that E and V bands can also be used for access as well as backhaul. And there is no way we can distinguish as to whether it is being used for access or backhaul. And you are aware that 5G can connect millions of users. And we are hoping that with E and V bands, we will be able to accomplish that for the nation. This is one reason. The second reason is it militates against the Supreme Court judgment. The Supreme Court had given a very clear and a definitive judgment for access network. But with E and V migrating into access, the way I explained just now, it becomes mandatory for government to auction it. Otherwise, there will be a huge amount of revenue loss to the government. And we will land up in another situation which is to be avoided. Third thing, we are providing similar type of services to the subscriber. Therefore, we should be treated at par with each other. So if the telcos are being asked to pay for a particular spectrum, then everybody else who's using that spectrum for similar services should also be asked to pay for the spectrum. It should be a level playing field. These are three. Let me start with these three arguments, and then as we progress, we can take it further.
Absolutely. We'll take forth other arguments as well, but let me bring in Mahesh Uppal into the picture as well. He patiently heard you out. So, Dr. Uppal, as far as the BIF is concerned, the BIF has a different take really as far as this entire issue is concerned. What is it?
However, let me say this, and my argument is more professional rather than a BIF argument. The argument is the following, that both E and V bands are currently liberalized in more than 20 countries in one case and more than 80 countries in the other. And in both cases, in most cases, these countries are at fairly advanced process when it comes to the deployment of 5G. So to argue that this is something that will make 5G difficult or complicated, or there will be technical issues, that I believe is not the problem. Now, it is true that the Supreme Court asked for spectrum auctions, and the argument that the Supreme Court made, or the judgment as I see it, is about disparate treatment, unequal treatment to people, and also about transparency. So you cannot have a non-transparent process, and you cannot leave anybody worse off. And I would argue that to allocate E&V without auctions neither contradicts the transparency part, nor does it actually leave anybody worse off, for the simple reason that all players who will seek to use it in the liberalized mode will all be at par in that sense. It's not as if somebody will get it free and others will have to pay for the same spectrum. That is not envisaged. Having said that, I do accept that there are issues in our licensing regime, right? And we are getting the wrong end of it. The wrong end is the following, that ideally across the world, you will find telecom operators actually advocating the liberalization of spectrum. We have created a licensing anomaly where some people find it more equitable that others are licensed. Now that is something that our licensing regime is responsible for, not actually the approach to E&V band. We have to fix this. We have to ensure that the telcos who have their licenses do not feel worse off. So we need to significantly improve, indeed actually revise their licensing commitments, reduce their licensing and other regulatory burdens so that they are actually at par with everyone else. So I do accept that there are some licensing issues, but I do not accept that E&V bands somehow should not be liberalized, because that would be totally inappropriate, because the regulators across the world are agreed that it is a great idea to liberalize both the E&V band. And just as a matter of detail, let me also say, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, it is true that the Supreme Court did leave some things hanging, but there is really no plan, and there doesn't seem to have been any effort to, for example, auction the microwave spectrum. And I do not believe that it is even the position of the COAI that such spectrum should be auctioned. So I think the focus was on access, focus was on creating exclusive rights at the cost of some other competitor, or a process that is not transparent. I believe none of those things is an issue in this.
All right. So I'm going to come back to you, General, because, Dr. Uppal has made some very valid points. You can respond to them. I'll come to you in a bit. But before that, let me bring in Ms. Dixit into the picture as well. Ms. Dixit, as far as, the industry bodies are concerned, we've heard them both out. They're clearly, not in agreement with each other. But both bodies want one thing, that is a level playing field. How do we achieve this level playing field, really? What's the best way to do that?
I would like to say that with the Supreme Court judgment of 2012, I'll differ from Mr. Uppal a little bit in that. My understanding is that we have moved away from administrative pricing of spectrum to auction-based pricing. So auction of spectrum, I think, will be necessary. What, however, needs to be considered is that auction, should they be only for the purpose of resource mobilization? Would that be the primary focus of auctions? Or should welfare element also come into that, and the spillover effects of the technologies that come in on account of these spectrum auctions? So that's a larger question that needs to be addressed, and especially with regard to the license fee and spectrum usage charges being there over the period of the license. We need to very, very clearly look at the reserve price that is set for the spectrum auctions. In any case, it's a market-based mechanism. So even if the reserve price is a little lower than what one would have thought, the market would discover the right price for it. We should not end up in a situation where it's the winner's curse and they end up with spectrum which they had not needed. And this situation of COVID, the pandemic has itself brought to the fore the importance and relevance of telecommunications, the need for being a stable and connected world. And so many things are dependent on it. Your transport, your education, your health, and businesses require all-time connectivity. So I think we can't wish that away, and we need to have a telecom, we need to also move with technology. So I think spectrum auctions is a way, but we need to look at the reserve price that we set for the spectrum auctions in a little more careful way.
Okay, we need to move with technology is what you're... Go ahead. Yeah, you wanted to add something.
I also wanted to say that wherever the 5G has come in, there are several countries which have already introduced 5G. In fact, we had also thought of introducing 5G by 2020. So I think we need to go, look at it a little more in detail. And with the forum having been set up, that forum comprised of members both from the various ministries as well as from the industry bodies and the service providers, as well as from IITs. So I think we need to look at that closely as well. But I think 5G and the auctions, it's a way we must go ahead with them.
Okay, we must go ahead with 5G and auctions. Technology keeps changing and we need to have the latest technology is what Ms. Dixit is suggesting. General, let me come to you. Respond to the points that have been made by Ms. Dixit as well as Dr. Uppal suggesting about the whole license issues that may be there really as far as this whole 5G is concerned and spectrum as a whole is concerned.
Sure. Let me start with a positive note. There are some points brought out by both of them which I agree to wholeheartedly. I would put it in a different way. I would say that COVID has shown us that telecom has become a foundational sector. It is no longer a vertical, it is a horizontal, on which other industries and other verticals will base their progress. So therefore, telecom is, if I may say so, an essential service. And the type of levies and fees and the prices that the government is imposing on telecom are far too high of what they should do on essential services, for example, on water and electricity. So that part I agree with them that it has to be looked into and the fees and levies have to be brought down. Now, coming to the points that Mr. Uppal brought out, I would like to say that the countries where this has become a free spectrum are highly fiberized. India is nowhere near fiberization. And with the type of obstacles we have in fiberization, we are not going to see fiberization happen in a hurry. It is surprising that even despite the central government giving guidelines to state governments about the pricing of ROW charges, it is not happening. Despite their pressure, it is not happening. They are levying atrocious amount of money for ROW charges. So those are the things which we have to live with. Second thing that he brought out was ENV ban. I would just say this, that ENV ban up to the 4G era was backhaul. In 5G era, it is no longer backhaul, especially in urban areas. This is now access as well as backhaul. So how do you distinguish? Are you going to auction access frequencies in a different manner? If so, where will ENV fall? They are going to be used for access also. Otherwise, the type of capacity that we have to deliver in high demanding areas like urban areas will not happen. So therefore, ENV has entered access. No way to differentiate between access and backhaul in this category. So, if you see it from the government point of view, there should be no loss to the exchequer. Are they going to delicense the entire access spectrum? If not, then ENV is access and can also be used for backhaul. That's the way we look at it. Internationally, if you look at, APT has already included ENV ban in the IMT 2020. And they have recommended to ITU to do the same. We believe ITU is going to come out with a notification very soon saying that these frequency bands are in IMT 2020 bucket. So therefore into 5G. And because they are into 5G, they are into access also. And hence the Supreme Court judgment and the precedence, which has been set since then, is auction and not allocation. With auction also comes the licensing regime. Yes, there are bad points about licensing. There are good points also. And the good points are having a tight leash on misuse of applications which are running on Spectrum, and which we find are happening in various areas. And cybersecurity is an issue all over. Now, with licensing, at least lawful interception, data privacy can be enforced on operators who are going onto this spectrum. So these are our arguments, and I think it should be auction and not allocated.
Okay, all right. So, Mr. Uppal, let me bring you in now. So, what is the middle
Sure.
path? You said you're an independent consultant. So, let's talk about how we be independent of all these problems and ensure that we go down the middle and take a middle path to this particular problem.
Yeah. You see, the first thing is the point about auctions. We keep saying auctions. Now let me just point out one data point, and that is the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum for Wi-Fi and the 5 gigahertz spectrum for Wi-Fi. One of them was delicensed before the Supreme Court decision, and the second one was auctioned several years after. So auction has not come in the way of any reform. And just like we agreed that those 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz do not imply unequal treatment for any user, and they are good for us, they actually make life easy for a whole lot of Wi-Fi users, etc., etc. And we all know we are all individually beneficiaries of that delicensing of that spectrum. So let's celebrate the fact that our licensing regime does not, and I repeat, does not prevent delicensing despite the Supreme Court judgment. In fact, the government on its own has been doing this. So that's one. I completely agree. In fact, I argued very, very strongly in favor of spectrum auctions right from the beginning. So I have in spirit, I have absolutely nothing against the Supreme Court judgment. I would be outraged if the terms on which this spectrum was going to be used by one group of people was different from another group of people. But let us remember that two wrongs do not make a right. We should actually be trying to get the best of the world's best practices. We should recognize the opportunity that these E and V bands offer and fix the difficulties in our licensing regime, the kind of difficulties General Kochhar is very rightly brought out. We should fix those so that we do not lose out on the E and V opportunity. That same thing. For example, the point about fiberization is extremely well made. Now, should that difficulty be the cause for us delaying or not having a certain kind of reform, a certain kind of flexibility in use of spectrum? I think that would be the wrong way to go about it. So clearly, government action, indeed action in partnership with telcos such as General Kochhar leads, and state governments, etc., that is extremely important because those are absolutely life-threatening issues as far as the telecom industry is concerned, and we need to fix them. But because they have not been fixed, to argue that something else, which is veritable reform, which is reform where there is virtually no disagreement across the world, and recall that virtually all these countries where this reform has taken place are ahead of us in the 5G deployment. So, yes, there are problems in our licensing regime. They need to be fixed. If it means that access spectrum should not be charged, so be it. But I do not believe that it is either the Supreme Court or the government's, neither the Supreme Court nor the government has actually been able to to stop delicensing of spectrum has not needed to. And I think that is the correct thing to do. And these are very, very important reforms, and they will open up a whole lot of things. But yes, if there are difficulties about a level playing field of the kind General Kochhar is saying, I'm all for them being addressed head on.
Absolutely. All right, let me broaden the scope of the discussion now. And, Ms. Dixit, let's talk about 5G as a whole. How much of a game changer is it going to be? Are we ready for 5G? And then there's this whole other problem of, security concerns attached with 5G and how countries around the world are looking at 5G and especially Huawei with a lot of skepticism. So what about how do we protect our own interests and how do we ensure that we protect the interests of the users as well? And that's where data privacy comes in.
It was with that very purpose that this forum that I mentioned earlier had been set up. And that forum had also looked at some of the issues arising. The whole ecosystem needs to be ready. And that whole ecosystem in terms of infrastructure, in terms of equipment, in terms of user case, the applications, the handsets, and a lot more, the skill sets also, including the skill sets. Even that needs to be ready. So the test beds have to be there for it. I believe some test beds have already been created for it. Maybe what we could look at is that before the commercial launch of the service, we could consider whether we could give that as an experimental basis to the service provider and see that they can see how to put it to commercial use, because that also will take time. It's a skill set which is not only with the telcos, but skill set needed at the other user end also, and the other stakeholders that come into the picture. Because if, say, for medical, if we are going to use, then there's a whole set of medical users who are going to be, and the doctors and nurses and all these people who are going to use that application that will come into the picture. So I believe that possibly we need to start with some kind of a test, not merely the test bus, but expanding it a little more further and see how it can be utilized in real life before going in for commercial use. Now, at that point, one needs to consider very carefully as to how to charge it, whether one needs to charge it, one gives it for free. That's an issue which will need to be considered very, very carefully. But other issues and enabling, and parallelly, what we should consider is look at the entire regulatory regime concerning this area, the right of way aspect which is there, the applications and software which is there, the data privacy issue which is there, security aspects are there. And add to that, you mentioned the firms which are supplying the equipment, and there are some firms which we are considering whether they should be allowed to participate in the auctions. That could also trigger an increase in the price of the equipment. So, but we have to strike a balance between whether security, safety, the national interest comes ahead of the price constraints. And I believe that the price can be, once we have moved into the auction mode, we possibly need to address this issue of the license fee, the revenue share model that we are currently having, and the rates that we are applying for that.
All right. Okay, time to get quick closing comments now from all my panelists with the best way forward. Starting first with you, General.
The best way forward, I would say, is for the government to recognize the telecom as an essential service, reduce the charges that they put as entry-level charges, then look at 5G as something which is going to increase the connectivity, give capacities which are desired, and will be the first technology which will have a man-machine talking to each other. Machine-machine, man-machine talking to each other. The first time it will happen. So therefore, the challenges will be new. It is not a network problem. It is a composite problem where the network team, the technology team, the business team, and the finance team have to sit together and see how 5G is to be rolled out for what use cases. And if you look at India, the government should see that this canopy, this sort of an overarching canopy has to be first made strong and laid. And therefore, the charges during that layout period have to be commensurate because there will be no ROI really speaking. World over, there are hardly any use cases, any commercial use cases. There are pilots, but there are hardly any use cases. So anybody who's investing crores and crores, thousands of crores of rupees would like a ROI, which is not going to happen so fast. So therefore, government has to see this initial path, and once it matures, that is the time government should again see telecom as giving a second primary revenue, which may not be very high.
Sure.
But the secondary revenue, which will come out of 5G canopy of the ecosystem which telecom will enable, that secondary revenue will far surpass what they can get out of telecom. So these are some of the things that the government has to look at. So in short, policies have to be looked at fresh, regulations have to be looked at fresh, fiscal measures have to be looked at afresh.
Absolutely. Points taken. All right, Mr. Uppal, very quickly.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, and I think as alluded to by General Kochhar as well, I do believe that a lot of what we need to do in the coming years will in fact be impeded by our licensing regime. Let me give you some examples. Currently, as General Kochhar will also know and talks about, close to 30% of the telcos' revenues go back to the government. Okay. Now that is a meaningless cost for an infrastructure that the whole economy uses, right? Now, so a lot of all that is coming to the costs that are being generated are generated because of a licensing regime.
Right.
The same licensing regime is getting us to a situation where we are opposing even things that are internationally good ideas. And let me give you 4 or 5 of them. We are opposing ENV band liberalization. We are not supportive of Wi-Fi hotspots. We are not particularly supportive of cable TV operators participating in telecom networks. There's a huge controversy about OTT players. Now, each one of those controversies has its roots in our licensing regime, where one group of people have paid and are continuing to pay very large sums of money to remain in business.
Absolutely.
So rather than deal with that and recognize that we will have other ways of making money for the whole economy, rather than do that, we are busy tinkering and creating more anomalies. So I would say fix the licensing regime, create a more liberal regime for all services, and depend on the impact of the sector on the economy for your revenues, as far as the exchequer is concerned. If we do that, then we will be pretty much in line with what the world does. And we will also be pretty much ready for all the benefits that the rest of the country. Sure. So I'm just saying we'll also get all the benefits.
Ms. Dixit, close the show for us in 30 seconds.
Okay. I would say that the new normal has brought to the fore the critical role of the telecommunications. It has also highlighted the digital divide. So we need to address that. Another thing I would like to say is that the licensing regime, there have been reforms. And 1999, we brought in the revenue share. So it's a question of reviewing it. It's not that everything is wrong with the licensing regime. And with the auctions coming in, I think a further review is required.
Okay. All right.
But yes.
Okay. On that note, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.